Opening the queen's diagonal instantly fights for central space. Developing the knight to a central square immediately contests white's ambitious pawn push, setting up a flexible defensive structure. Establishing immediate central control, this thrust aims to restrict black's knight and prepare for an onslaught on the queen side. Embracing the fianchetto prepares for a dynamic kingside build-up, potentially challenging white's central ambition later. Developing the knight to c3 prepares to castle quickly and supports the d4 pawn, solidifying the center while maintaining flexibility. Confronting the center immediately, black boldly challenges white's central pawns and opens lines for immediate counterplay. Strikes at the pawn center, opening lines for piece activity, while also relinquishing central control. Reclaiming the central pawn, black opens lines and prepares to contest the open d-file while developing actively. Seizing central space aggressively, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's knight and opens lines for piece development, creating dynamic possibilities. Conceding the central pawn majority for freer development, black seeks active piece play rather than material advantage, aiming to exploit white's slightly less harmonized structure. Opening the b-file aggressively, this pawn advance not only secures the central outpost on e4, but also unlocks the queen and rook for immediate central influence, creating significant pressure. Unleashing the bishop to its natural diagonal, black prepares to castle, aiming to tuck the king away while simultaneously eyeing white's potentially vulnerable central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to an active square like e3 aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, while also potentially eyeing central squares if the opportunity arises. Challenging the central pawn structure immediately, black initiates a dynamic struggle, aiming to disrupt white's knight development and create immediate attacking chances along the newly opened c-file. Developing the knight here strategically solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for castling, aiming to harmonize the pieces for an impending kingside attack. Unleashing the queen to a5 immediately questions white's central pawns, seeking counterplay and putting pressure on the c3 pawn, while simultaneously eyeing potential tactics involving the bishop on g7 and the knight on f6. 9. qd2 unifies the rooks and prepares to contest the queenside, aiming to liberate the c1 bishop while keeping an eye on potential queenside pawn breaks for black. Connecting the rooks, this knight move tidies up black's development and prepares for a central pawn push, perhaps e5, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain more active piece play. Asserting pressure on the queen side, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit the semi-open b-file. This proactive stance prevents black from comfortably developing their pieces and hints at future pawn advances or piece activity along the flank. Opening the d-file with this capture forces white to decide how to recapture, potentially disrupting their central pawn structure and creating a target for black's rooks. Opening the c-file with this pawn capture dramatically alters the pawn structure, potentially granting white long-term control over that crucial lane. The immediate consequence is the creation of doubled pawns on the c-file, a common positional weakness, but here it's balanced by the open communication for white's rook. Black's response will dictate whether this structural imbalance becomes a genuine liability or a mere pawn sacrifice for dynamic compensation. The central tension is now largely resolved, pushing the game into a more strategic, positional phase where piece activity and prophylactic maneuvering will be paramount. Exchanging queens here significantly alters the dynamic, immediately easing the queenside pressure black had exerted with that timely Ka5. This simplification pushes the game towards an endgame where white's pawn structure, while slightly doubled on the b-file, benefits from open lines for the rooks and a potential passed pawn down the c-file if they can organize it. Black must now be mindful of coordinating their pieces effectively without the queen's attacking power, aiming to exploit white's slightly compromised kingside pawn structure or find opportunities on the open d-file. The immediate tactical threats are gone, making calculated positional maneuvering the paramount concern for both sides moving forward. The White King's journey to d2, though seemingly a retreat, solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares for a more active role in the upcoming middle game, potentially supporting a kingside advance or even joining the fight on the queenside if an open file emerges. Castling short provides immediate sanctuary for the king, bringing it out of the central crossfire and initiating the long-term safety plan. This bishop's development aims to solidify control of the central light squares and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, potentially setting up a fianchetto structure for a more robust defense or even an eventual attack, while also offering a retreat square for the king if necessary. Initiating a gradual pawn advance in the center often serves to solidify a king's safety, a sensible priority given the current pawn structure and the open d-file. Asserting control over the open c-file and preparing to pressure black's d-pawn, the rook's deployment marks a crucial juncture for white's initiative. Asserting control over the open files is paramount here, and channeling that rook towards the d-file, an area of considerable positional interest, seems logical. Anchoring the rook on the fourth rank here significantly bolsters white's control over the central files, creating a formidable defensive barrier and simultaneously preparing for potential advances on the kingside. Developing the bishop to a slightly more active square, BD7 aims to connect the rooks and prepares for potential pawn advances or maneuvers on the queenside, while also bolstering the defense of the c-file where white's rook has established itself. Unleashing a bishop to attack the knight on c6, white aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses. This move initiates a tactical skirmish, forcing black to decide whether to defend the knight, retreat it, or even sacrifice material to maintain equality. The board's geometry is shifting rapidly as white probes for vulnerabilities. Probing the kingside pawns with the bishop now presents an opportunity for black to reinforce their central structure by stepping the f-pawn forward, a necessary preparatory maneuver before any potential kingside counterplay can be seriously contemplated. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal presence after black's knight retreated offers improved pressure along the a7-g1 diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses around black's castled king, while also bolstering white's central influence. Fortifying the queenside structure with b6 seeks to secure the light-squared bishop and prepare for potential queenside expansion or consolidation, a wise step given white's central pawn majority and potential kingside activity. Consolidating the king's position becomes paramount as the game shifts towards a potential endgame, freeing the rook from its defensive obligation and preparing for a more active role. The rook on c8 immediately contests the open file, a crucial battleground given white's exposed king and the potential for future pawn breaks. Unifying the rooks along the semi-open c-file signifies a commitment to contesting this crucial pathway, aiming to exert pressure and potentially launch an assault on black's queenside structure, while also preparing for future transitions into an endgame where rook activity often dictates outcomes. Repositioning the bishop from its active attacking diagonal to a more defensive role on f8, black aims to shore up the kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances or an exchange on the d-file, acknowledging white's central pawn majority and the open c-file. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside with g4 seeks to seize space and create attacking chances against black's uncastled monarch, a bold maneuver that gambles on dynamism over immediate structural integrity. Activating the bishop towards the center strengthens black's central control and prepares for potential pawn breaks later on. This pawn thrust, advancing along the kingside, aims to restrict black's bishop and create potential weaknesses for a future kingside attack. But it also slightly weakens white's own king's safety and sacrifices potential central control for a more aggressive posture. Seeking to consolidate the king's position and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, this maneuver re-anchors the monarch in a safer haven away from the open c-file, while simultaneously opening up a path for the rook to potentially join the queenside action. Shifting the rook to the c-file signals a strategic realignment, aiming to exert pressure on the weak pawns and potential entry points on that side of the board, while simultaneously preparing to contest the open file should black's pieces become too passive or defensively oriented. Opening up the bishop's diagonal to the queenside offers a crucial counter-penetration possibility, challenging white's coordinated rook pressure by introducing a new attacker onto the b-file and eyeing potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. The rook reclaims a crucial file, re-establishing central influence and preparing to contest the open c-file, a key positional objective in this endgame. Repositioning the bishop to its former diagonal prepares a more active role, aiming to disrupt white's control of the central light squares and potentially target the pawn chain. Rethinking the board after the queen exchange, white is realigning the rooks to improve their coordination and potentially apply pressure on the queen side or centralize them. This maneuver aims to escape the pin on the c-file and prepare for future pawn advances or rook activity. This maneuver reestablishes a crucial outpost for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and prevent any easy encroachment on black's queenside. The chessboard appears to be stuck in a positional stalemate. White's repeated maneuver on the c-file, mirroring black's earlier response, offers no new attacking prospects, but rather reinforces the current static setup. The bishop lunges to a3, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched pawn structure and potentially initiate a tactical exchange that would weaken the kingside. This bishop's journey from d7 to a3 is a bold maneuver, seeking active counterplay against white's slightly passive development, forcing white to decide between maintaining their pawn chain or dealing with the immediate threat. Asserting control over the central files now becomes paramount, as the rooks engage in a bit of a positional dance, aiming to dislodge the adversary's bishop from its prominent outpost on a3. Seeking a safer square, black's bishop vacates the crowded queenside, hoping to find a more active diagonal while simultaneously probing white's rook placement. The white rook retreats, re-evaluating its influence on the central files and the b-file, perhaps anticipating a regrouping maneuver to better contest black's growing space on the kingside, or to reinforce the d-file in anticipation of further pawn advances or piece exchanges. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, this advance aims to shatter white's defensive structure and reclaim the initiative. Stepping back from the brink of a perpetual repetition, white judiciously repositions the rook, preparing to contest the crucial central files and potentially launch a more concerted assault on black's somewhat exposed king after the awkward knight retreat. A bold positioning of the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's queenside control and potentially exploit the a-file if it opens, though it also sacrifices some defensive mobility. Initiating a dynamic repositioning with the rook, this maneuver seeks to unburden the cramped queenside and prepare for a more active role, potentially by supporting an advance on the kingside or by reinforcing the central pawn structure. Shifting attention to the queenside, the pawn advance to a6 creates a new foothold, subtly contesting the c-file and preparing potential future pawn pushes or simply solidifying the structure against white's encroaching rooks. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and create attacking chances, though it potentially weakens his own king's safety. Unleashing the f-pawn like a battering ram, this gambit aims to shatter the pawn shield around white's king and inject immediate chaos into the position. The dynamic exchange promises to open crucial lines for black's rooks and bishop, potentially creating devastating tactical possibilities if white is unprepared to defend accurately. Unlocking the central pawn chain, this thrust aims to shatter black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. Accepting the pawn thrust opens a vital diagonal for white's bishop and challenges black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. Unlocking the d-file now presents a significant opportunity for white to activate their rooks and press on the queenside, transforming a passive position into one with dynamic attacking potential. Steering the knight towards the queenside, this maneuver aims to create active squares for the piece and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure by threatening advances. The position is rife with tension, particularly around white's isolated d5 pawn. Black's objective here is to exploit that weakness, either by forcing its advance or by establishing strong piece play against it. The knight on b4 could become a powerful outpost, pressuring the queenside pawns and preparing for further incursions. It's a subtle attempt to seize the initiative and introduce complications before white can consolidate. That fork on the king and rook is a classic disruptive tactic, seizing the initiative and forcing a concrete response that significantly alters the pawn structure and potentially simplifies the position. Relocating the monarch to the 7th rank is a desperate attempt to escape the gnawing pressure on the queen side, but it exposes the king to potential threats along the e-file. Dislodging the rook from that pinning square, white opens up the possibility of regaining material equality through forcing exchanges, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed monarch in the ensuing simplification. The rook recaptures, solidifying control over the open c-file but entering a tense situation as white's knight maintains a powerful outpost. A strategic retreat that clears the way for the bishop to support the central pawn push, aiming to cramp black's position and prepare for a potential breakthrough. The knight's sudden appearance on c2 introduces significant tactical tension, aiming to disrupt white's rook coordination and potentially exploit the pinned pawn on b2. Seizing the opportunity, white decisively captures the knight, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the exposed black king by clearing a path for the rook. The king's newly acquired open avenues on the c-file demand immediate attention, as the doubled pawns on the queen side become a ripe target for the incoming rook. Reclaiming the rook after the exchange aims to re-establish material parity and initiate a fight for control of the now open central files. Resigning the initiative and surrendering the central files feels like a concession, allowing white's rook to dominate the open column while black's pieces remain awkwardly positioned, potentially paving the way for white to exploit the open lines and target black's king. Gaining territory on the king side opens up avenues for attack, but it also leaves the monarch slightly more exposed. Consider the long-term implications of this pawn push on piece activity for both sides. The bishop retreats to a more stable square, eyeing the central d5 pawn and preparing to support potential pawn pushes later. Initiating an offensive on the king side, white gambles by sacrificing pawn structure for a potentially dangerous assault, hoping to exploit the exposed black monarch and create attacking chances on the now weakened light squares. Gaining space on the queen side with the pawn push immediately creates issues for the white king's protection, as it opens lines that can be exploited by black's rooks and bishop. The monarch's repositioning opens pathways for a more active involvement, potentially creating tactical threats or defending weaknesses now that the immediate skirmish is over. Securing the bishop on the queen side, the black bishop repositions itself to an active outpost, eyeing weaknesses on the queen side and preparing for potential future advances. This knight's relocation to d4 finally offers a reprieve from the relentless defensive maneuvering, aiming to shore up the king's safety and potentially activate the bishop. Unleashing the rook to the open first rank opens up new possibilities for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps even target their uncastled king. Bringing the rook to the 2nd rank now prepares to double down on the open h-file, aiming to pierce black's defensive structure and create mating threats against the exposed monarch. Reactivating the rook to the central file aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially create counterplay, though it risks exposing itself to further threats if white can skillfully reposition. Pivoting the king forward seems an attempt to rally some defensive spirit, but this aggressive thrust exposes it to the encroaching black pieces, potentially leading to a swift unraveling of white's position. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn opens a decisive assault on white's exposed king, leveraging the newly freed diagonals for maximum penetration. Seizing the open file with the bishop opens new avenues for attack and simplifies the position, eliminating a piece that was hindering central control. The rook is now actively participating, eyeing the weakened king side and preparing to exploit the open files. Activating the rook on the d-file opens up possibilities for centralizing the king and consolidating the pawn structure, a crucial step as material equalizes and the king's safety becomes paramount. Securing the king's central position is paramount now as the passed pawn advances, potentially creating unstoppable force. Reclaiming the piece allows white to simplify into a potentially favorable rook and pawn ending. A king exposed and suddenly isolated on the open d-file, facing imminent threats from the rook on the 7th rank. The white monarch now ventures into the center, initiating a bold repositioning to secure central influence and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances, or to escape further threats from the now active black bishop. Unleashing the king's latent power, this maneuver aims to infiltrate enemy territory, disrupting the otherwise solid pawn structure and creating potential mating nets around the white monarch. The monarch's journey to security is paramount now, as the opposing king has boldly ventured into the heart of the battlefield. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority now is the main idea, as the king needs activity to support the advance. The king cautiously retreats, seeking the safety of the queenside corner to avoid the discovered attack after the bishop's unavoidable advance. Unleashing a pawn storm with a pawn, black aggressively seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and create critical weaknesses, aiming to open lines for their rook and ultimately pressure the isolated queenside pawns. Opening up the queenside flank for the black king's pawn advance is a dubious concession, potentially unleashing powerful counterplay. The pawn on b3 establishes a crucial outpost for the black knight, threatening to infiltrate the white camp and exploit any weaknesses in the pawn structure, especially around the king. Securing the advanced passed pawn's path forward by solidifying the bishop's defensive post guarantees this pawn's continued march towards promotion, while simultaneously pinning down black's bishop and restricting its defensive capabilities. The king's daring march into the heart of the pawn structure dramatically alters the endgame dynamics, presenting both potential victory and perilous exposure. Initiating a bold repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure or prepare for a timely advance. Opening the bishop's diagonal creates an immediate threat along the c-file, putting pressure on the isolated rook. Unleashing a surprising repositioning, the bishop abandons its passive guard on the queenside to directly challenge the advanced enemy pawn structure. This audacious maneuver aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn wall and potentially create weaknesses that can be exploited in the upcoming endgame, hinting at a subtle shift in the battlefield's dynamics towards a more active confrontation. The bishop retreats to a more stable square, recognizing that its previous outpost was precarious and could have led to a swift loss after the rook was forced to move. Proactively reinforcing the advanced bishop's grip on the c4 square secures a vital outpost, preventing black from establishing any meaningful counterplay on the queenside. Harnessing the power of the discovered attack, black's king now has a commanding presence, eyeing the weakened pawn structure around white's monarch. Proposing a daring pawn sacrifice to activate the bishop and target black's vulnerable queenside pawns. Shifting the bishop to this square offers a final defensive stand for the queen's pawn, but it effectively sacrifices the bishop's long-term activity and potential for counterplay. This repositioning of the bishop to the central square aims to fortify the pawn chain and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance, though it offers little immediate tactical threat. The king's relocation to the center offers a surprising but potentially crucial attempt to disrupt white's coordinated forces and activate a dormant threat on the kingside. Prioritizing king's safety becomes paramount now that the queens are off. White's bishop aims to establish a strong defensive outpost, anticipating potential peace exchanges that could leave the monarch exposed. Black's king, previously tucked away, now ventures into the fray, a bold gamble that could either ignite a decisive attack or leave it dangerously exposed to white's lurking pieces. Pivoting the bishop here is a defensive maneuver, repositioning it to guard against potential pawn pushes and maintain a protective triangle around the king as the position simplifies. The pawn grab on h4, while appearing tempting, significantly compromises your king's safety by opening a critical diagonal and removing a vital defender from the kingside. Opening up the king's path to the queenside now, the bishop is repositioned to the central diagonal, aiming to disrupt the opposing pawn structure and create weaknesses. The bishop on f7 is now a key defender of the kingside pawn structure, but its maneuver opens a diagonal for white's rook to potentially attack along. Maintaining the central vice, this placement consolidates the bishop's influence and prepares for further maneuvering on the kingside, potentially aiming to restrict the opponent's rook activity or create new attacking avenues. The monarch ventures out, embracing the open space and potentially creating active play, but it also exposes itself to lurking dangers on the open board. A final positional consolidation begins as the bishop aims to shore up the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential endgame maneuver. The bishop's repositioning to g8 aims to reinforce the g7 pawn and potentially redeploy to a more active diagonal, perhaps along the a2-g8 line if white's king becomes exposed.